Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on the time of day you're listening to this and getting your module on invasive exotic species. We'll be talking about some identification and control in the second part of the module. While I say some identification, this program could go on for days and days. If you allowed me to, I probably would talk that long, but you probably don't want to hear it that long, do you? So, what are invasive exotic plants? They're non-native plants that alter the functions and value of natural areas by displacing native species and disrupting natural processes such as fire and water flow. Good example are some of the old world climbing fern and the Japanese climbing fern. They bring fire up to the canopy in trees that don't generally have a problem with fire in our fire-dependent communities of Central Florida. But once it gets the fire carried up to the top of the canopy, that usually causes a lot of problems for those particular species of trees. Why are invasives a concern? Again, I mentioned how they disrupt the ecological and our natural ecosystems. In some cases, they'll displace native plants or animal species. Uh, for example, Australian pines, which we talked about in botany a little bit, they have such a shallow root system. They're usually right near the beach. They tolerate salt water quite well, and it makes it difficult for sea turtles to build nests where there is an abundance of Australian pines. They can degrade biodiversity or diversity. Some of these invasive exotics form thick monocultures. A good example of that would be Melaleuca or the punk tree in the Everglades. Speaking of the Everglades, it could alter the hydrological patterns or the soil chemistry. Some of these plants put out allelopathic or toxic chemicals that prevent other plants from growing nearby. In some cases, the invasive exotic plants are able to hybridize with our native species of certain plants. Good example is lantana. We have a native species or two of lantana in the state of Florida. Mention that some plants have toxins that may be harmful to people or animals. A good example of this would be Brazilian pepper. It's actually a cousin to poison ivy. They're in the same family. And it becomes costly for homeowners, land managers, and the like to get rid of them or control them or keep them out altogether. Just remember, although I'm going to be talking about plants today in this program, there are plenty of other invasive things that we deal with in the state of Florida or the United States of America or North America, whether it's in the sea with lionfish or zebrafish or whatever that is. We get new insects introduced into the state of Florida frequently. Asian cycad scale, obviously it's from Asia, and it attacks our sago, parenthetically palm, trees and causes them to usually die from the heavy feeding. You can see how white those leaves are. Those are tens of thousands of scale insects sucking out the life juices that the plant is producing and needing to grow. We also have invasive exotic animals on the land. For example, the giant toads, Bofo marinus, the Bofo frogs or toads. They will secrete poison near their shoulder blades, if you will. And if your pet, your dog, for example, goes chasing after one and clamps down on one, some dogs have been sickened, poisoned, or have died from such um, release of those toxic chemicals directly into their mouth. One of the worst infections right now going around is caused by the Asian citrus psyllid. We'll talk about him and her a little later in citrus, but this is the insect vector that moves citrus greening from tree to tree. And as an adult, they can fly. Of course, we know about the invasive snake species, especially in the Everglades. So, what you'll learn today. We're going to do some identification of common invasive exotic plants here in Central Florida. I'll talk about removal and control tactics and some best management practices at the end of this second module. Let's talk about Brazilian pepper. It's a native of Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. Okay, so it's native to another continent. It was introduced into Florida in the 1840s as an ornamental. In fact, its common name for many years was Florida holly. Funny thing, it's not from Florida, nor is it a holly, as you've learned already in this module, that it is a cousin to poison ivy. Flowering occurs primarily in fall. The flowers are relatively insignificant. The female Brazilian pepper tree will produce beautiful red berries in right around Christmas time, and stands out against the nice dark green leaves. It is pretty. It can identified by turpentine and peppery smell when the leaves are crushed. I find it very easy to identify it in the fall, winter when it's got the red berries on the female, because this is a dioecious or dioecious, two ecious houses, so you will only have the red berries on the female plants and not the male plants, as we've learned in botany. It's a very aggressive invader of disturbed habitats, and especially aquatic areas. It has really outcompeted some of our native mangrove stands here in the state of Florida. Dispersal is by various mechanisms. Obviously, the red berries are attractive to various wildlife, birds, for example, mammals, and it's also spread when people try to get rid of it in the winter months when it's cooler and easier to do it. And if the female berries are ripe, they drag it down to the side of the street for disposal, and the berries get disseminated, or they put it in the back of their pickup truck and they don't tarp it, and all those seeds keep flying off alongside the roads. What's weird about this plant is it has a huge survival rate for the seedlings, but this is true of many invasive exotic plants. Flowers are pollinated by insects, but we won't go into great details here. Now I have the cut stump method. I'll talk more about that in the second part of the module for invasive exotic plants and their control, but what this basically is saying is you cut the plant down and then you will treat the cut stump with an appropriate herbicide or weed killer. Here's Brazilian pepper. You can see it's a thick monoculture, and it loves the area where mangroves also will grow in that brackish or even salty water along the Gulf. Unfortunately, Brazilian pepper doesn't have the structure of mangroves that is great for young fish and other aquatic wildlife to hide, breed, and live their life cycle. It's actually relatively bad for the habitat for wildlife, whereas mangroves are very good for aquatic wildlife in their habitat. And it displaces the mangroves, which also serve to protect the coastline during storm surges from those named wind events. Australian pine, Casuarina ecosetafolia, for those that remember back to the botany module. It is from Australia and other areas around there, Malaysia, etc. It was brought to the United States for ornamental values. It has a pine-like appearance. It grows very, very tall, up to 100 feet or more in height, although generally I haven't seen it that tall in Florida, but I did see it about that tall in the Hawaiian Islands when I lived there many, many years ago. One of the reasons it was brought here is it's fast growing. So it was used for various things like wind breaks and stuff like that. Sad part of this is it's very shallowly rooted and is one of the first plants to blow over during a windy day. Again, it flowers year-round. The seeds get dispersed, in the wind and things like that. It also has a suckering habitat from the roots, so it really forms these huge thickets of plants Also, it puts out substances, not exactly sure what compounds, that are leliopathic. $10 word that kind of means it keeps other plants away from growing in that area. Alleliopathy we'll talk more about when we get to mulch. Again, it inhibits the growth of a lot of these plants underneath, so it really outcompetes many other plants that are much more beneficial to be on the beaches. It loves our nutrient poor soils, which is typically found along the beaches. Again, the cut stump method, what you do is you chainsaw these down or cut them down, and then you paint the appropriate herbicide to the conductive tissue, the xylem and phloem. Chinese tallow is a deciduous tree with milky sap up to 30 feet. I've seen them taller than that, but about 30 feet. Flowers from March to May. Again, the flowers are not very attractive. It is wind pollinated, and it is a dioecious, so it has separate male flowers and separate female flowers on the same plant. The male is called the catkin. The fruit ripens in fall into or late summer into fall. It was brought here for ornamental reasons. It has some decent fall color. It turns yellow and reds in the fall, which we don't get a lot of great fall color in Central Florida. Young trees establish a taproot and then are very good at surviving periods of drought. One of its claims to fame is why we would grow it as an ornamental plant, but it produces a lot of seeds, obviously. And birds are one of the primary ways that the seeds get dispersed into areas that we don't want it to be. A lot of our invasive exotics simply have escaped our cultivation of them. Also, if the seeds are near a body of water or potential floodplain or something like that, they can move around. Again, you see this cut stump method of control, cutting it down and then painting a herbicide appropriate to the conductive tissue of the plant. Now, I've been talking a little bit about herbicides, and I'll get into details in the second module of this program, but if you don't put on herbicides onto a lot of these plants that you cut down, remember we're breaking apical dominance. If we remember back to the botany module, we did that with those impatiens, and we got bushier impatiens when they got leggy. When you cut these plants down, a lot of times you break apical dominance, and now all of a sudden you have a thicket of a whole bunch of trees coming up from the root system. So a herbicide, when used very carefully and in the right concentration, will prevent that from happening. It'll ultimately be the best way of controlling such plants that tend to do this. Melaleuca. Some of you may know it as a punk tree. I don't hear that term so much up here as it's more commonly heard down further south where Melaleuca or the punk tree is more common. It is cold sensitive, so we're kind of at its northern limit. Occasionally near the coast of Pasco, I'll see them from time to time, but they're not as common as they are a little further south. Again, it's a subtropical tree. It has white paper-like bark, and it grows up to 50 feet tall. It spreads rapidly, converting native plant communities such as the bald cypress domes in the Everglades into a thicket or a monoculture of Melaleuca trees. Actually, Melaleuca seeds were brought here from Australia in the 1920s and dispersed by planes over the Everglades by humans. The idea was that we would dry up the wetlands of the Everglades so humans, could use that land for something that they wanted to use it for, whether it was production of food crops or, for that matter, homes and businesses and all that. So humans literally brought this here, purposefully introduced it to dry up the Everglades. It became an obvious failed experiment. Sieves are moved by wind in some cases, and of course, because it likes it pretty wet and swampy, it is moved in the waters in the Everglades. Again, typically, control is to cut this down and use the cut stump method down in the Everglades where they don't have, can't chop them all down. They'll hack and squirt, which we'll talk about that later on. Carrot wood. Let's just look at the picture a minute. You can see why humans might want to have that in their garden. The seed pods are very, very ornamental. Those are the seeds and the covering bracts or whatever they are. So it's very, very ornamental. It's a fast-growing evergreen tree. A lot of people want fast-growing and evergreen and ornamental trees. Flowers January into March. The flowers are not that particularly ornamental. It Again, it was introduced here. It forms monocultures. It produces an abundance of seeds, and it is dispersed by obviously mammals, birds, and things like that. Pretty much said that, but again, if you cut this down and don't use a herbicide, expect a whole thicket of carrotwood trees coming up from the root system. Again, you can see just how many seeds have been produced by this particular branch of this particular carrotwood tree. Chinaberry, again, also brought here for its ornamental value. The lower picture, you can see the purple, lilac, whatever color you want to call that, flowers. It doesn't look very spectacular here, but in the spring it has a haze of kind of purple-blue flowers, somewhat reminiscent of jacaranda trees, which are not invasive, but they are exotic. But this tree produces an abundance of seeds, as you can see. All those flowers become a seed, and they have big clusters of them that are relatively ornamental as well in the summer months into the fall. Again, the seeds are moved by birds and mammals that find it attractive for food, and of course they digest that seed. It goes through their system quite well and then gets deposited somewhere else with a little fertilizer package. China berry, let's just look at the leaf for a second. That is one leaf that the person is holding in his or her hand. I guess it's him. So if we remember back to our botany days, how could I tell that was just one leaf? Well, I would look where the pears are and I would notice that there is no bud down there. So I have to go all the way back past his wrist to the left hand side of the picture, and there would be a big large bud where it was attached to the branch. So this is a doubly compound leaf. Gosh, splitters, isn't that great to know that, hear that again? Kogon grass. It was introduced into Florida just, I believe, outside of Brooksville. It was brought here as a potential forage crop for livestock. Unfortunately, livestock doesn't particularly care to eat it. It was considered one of the 10 worst weeds in the world. I'm not sure why it got that designation, but it did. What's interesting about it is in the state of Florida, its primary spread is not through the seed heads that you can see, or the flowers here, or the seed heads developing on the right-hand picture. Those are the flowers and developing seed heads. But it is primarily spread through its suckering or running habit that it has. How they figured that out is they did a lot of DNA testing of different plant stands throughout the state of Florida and found that there was very low diversity, which that indicates that it's not sexually reproduced but asexually reproduced. Another way for this to spread is on lawn mowing equipment when they mow big expanses of roadside weeds and grass and whatnot. This is probably the one and only grass I can tell you that is very easy to identify even if you don't have a seed head. Look at the lower picture on the left. See the white midrib, but it's not right down the center. It's always offset to the right or left of center. I can't think of any other plant at least in the grass family, that has that unusual characteristic of having an offset midrib or center vein. It's not in the center. Who knows why? That's a big kahuna question, I guess. Here's one that we do get in homeowners asking us about it a lot is torpedo grass. It will survive in home situations in and amongst the turf grass and is very difficult to control. Think of its common name, torpedo. If you look at the lowest picture that says rhizome, that is the runner or modified stem. A rhizome is a modified stem. We remember that from botany, and it has nodes and internodes. So the rhizome will shoot or be like a torpedo underneath your turf grass, and it'll go feet in a year, feet and feet in some cases if the conditions are right. And because it has a thick, fleshy rhizome, it's an underground storage organ for the plant as well. It makes herbicides very difficult job to control them, even with herbicides. Uh, what only thing we can really do is apply foliar applications of herbicides containing generally glyphosate or Roundup. Unfortunately, Roundup, glyphosate is a generic, or the chemical name generically known. It also is a non-selective herbicide. So if it's torpedo grass is coming up into your desirable turf grass, there is no selective control for one grass versus the other. Kudzu. Now, some of you who are from the deep south, but not necessarily central Florida, know this as a terrible vine in Georgia, in Alabama, Mississippi, etc. It's a woody vine. It rapidly overtakes trees and shrubs, especially further north of here. Kudzu is not very commonly found in central Florida. There is a stand that I can think of right across the street from the extension office here in Dave City. But what it is commonly confused is with air potato. We have an abundance of air potato and not very much kudzu by comparison. It can completely envelop trees, other shrubs, other plants, and basically works like a big old umbrella, outcompeting the desirable vegetation for light. It is a flowering plant. It flowers in the late part of summer into the early fall. If you look at the flowers, you may go, gee, it looks a lot like wisteria. If you've ever grown wisteria further north, well, it is a cousin to wisteria. It's in the legume family, the bean and pea family, Fabaceae. Also, much like a lot of plants in the Fabaceae, look at the lower right-hand picture, that is a compound leaf. Methods to control aren't especially easy, but are possible with a foliar application of the appropriate herbicides, or in some cases the cut stump method, which would be a lot more tedious to cut these vines and then paint the cut remainder that's remaining in the ground. I would go with the foliar. Apply the herbicide when the flowers are visible. You're thinking, gee, that was in the fall. A lot of times some of these invasive exotic plants will expend a lot of energy to grow all summer to produce flowers. And if we hit them right at the time of flowering, a lot of times that will weaken them more substantially than if you hit them in the spring with their first application of herbicide. But like many invasive exotic plants, it's not generally one application of herbicide or two applications of herbicide. It's multiple applications of herbicides over multiple years. Here is probably what most people are confusing for kudzu, air potato. It's Dioscorea bulbifera. It was brought to Florida as an ornamental plant. As you can see the leaf in the lower right-hand picture, it has nice dark green, somewhat glossy leaves that are heart-shaped, distinctively heart-shaped. Also look at the prominent veins in that particular photograph. You also notice that it's a simple leaf. It is not a compound leaf like kudzu has. Air potato rarely flowers, at least here in the state of Florida. It's primarily spread by the air potato tubers. As you can see, they'll hang onto the vine, and even the smallest little potato, quote, quote, potato, will become a new plant next season. It is herbaceous, whereas kudzu is woody. So they're very easy to distinguish from one another. And a lot of people that grew up in Central Florida with this plant nearby, like Steve Cox, who you heard throw me under the bus in his module, he used to use this and throw it at his buddies when he was a kid here in Dave City and would help to disseminate this plant throughout town. Thanks, Steve. The leaves can be fairly large, up to 8 inches long, and they're, like I said, distinctively heart-shaped. Now, control is very, very difficult. Those small tubers or aerial bulbs, whatever you want to call them, will drop to the ground in the winter months, and they will start to germinate or regrow in the spring. And after a while, that bulb will get bigger in the ground, and we have one here in the office that's about 12 pounds, about the size of a large bowling ball, and it's trying to grow even though it's nowhere near soil or water. I've nicknamed him Seymour. We'll see how long Seymour will survive before he gives up the ghost. Last time I had an air potato in an office with no water or fertilizer or soil, and it was about the size of a baseball, lived for about a year and a half before it finally died. A lot of these invasive exotics are extremely tenacious. In years past, we would do a lot of air potato roundups. In other words, picking up the potatoes, quote, quote, they're not truly a potato, and throwing them into the garbage or destroying them by burning them. Herbicides can be used. They don't do a very good job because that thick tuber or bulb stores a lot of energy. So it's multiple applications of herbicide over multiple years. And the other problem is most of the time air potato intermingled with either desirable vegetation or it's over top of desirable trees and shrubs. So usually it means getting rid of the potatoes by digging and destroying the air potatoes by doing these roundups. Let's look at the leaves of kudzu versus air potato. Kudzu, you can see, has the purple flowers in the later part of summer, and it's a compound leaf. You would trace each of those leaflets back to the stem and you would realize there's a bud down there. So this is a trifoliate or compound leaf. Whereas air potato is distinctly heart-shaped and it's a simple leaf. Skunk vine. We get this one probably more often than most of the invasive exotics into the office. It's a fast-growing, it's a woody vine with a skunk-like smell. Part of its scientific name is fetida. Fetid, bad odor. Why do you think a plant would put out a bad odor? Kind of smells skunky or like a sewer. Sometimes it gets called sewer vine. Well, think if you're a browsing herbivore, like a deer. You start nibbling at that and it would put out a bad odor that you would smell and equate it to something similar in smell to fecal material. You would probably quit eating it very quickly and learn that that's not a plant you want to eat. Also probably helps ward off insects from feeding on it as well. It can create dense canopies that can cause damage or death to desirable vegetation, whether it's native or well-adapted exotic plants that aren't invasive. It flowers in the summer into the fall and it has little pink, doesn't show up real well in this picture, little pink almost bell-shaped flowers. They're about a quarter inch or so. They're kind of pretty in flower, and of course all those flowers become little kind of yellow round berries or fruits, which are disseminated by animals and dropped to the ground in your garden. Again, control is difficult with this. Partially it's a woody vine, partially it's because it's usually growing over more desirable vegetation, and using most herbicides sprayed over the top will also damage or kill the host plant that it's climbing or clinging to or twining around. Let me go back a second. Of course, it's vine like some of the other plants, and it usually is intertwined with more desirable vegetation. So herbicides are very difficult to use, but possible to get it under control. Probably best because it's woody would be the stump cut method, as I've mentioned from some of these other plants. Rosary pea, we generally don't see this brought into the office, but I want to make you aware of it for a couple of reasons. It is a legume as well as kudzu. So if you notice the flowers look like a bean or a green bean flower, if you've ever grown that, or sweet peas or things like that. So it's in the Fabaceae. The flowers are a little bit ornamental. The seed pods aren't so ornamental until the seeds are ripe. As you can see in the right hand side of the picture, the reddish orange and black seed. They're very, very pretty and very, very attractive to many people. A lot of times people will pick these and make jewelry by drilling a small little hole and stringing it together. And of course, a lot of kids find this very, very pretty. Now, what do young girls or boys that wear this as a jewelry might do if it's around their neck or their arm? A lot of times they like to chew on things. These seeds are poisonous. One seed probably going into your system whole, you may feel something as an adult. As a child, you probably have some intestinal distress, maybe. Could have an allergic response, you never know to these things. But the point is, one seed going through your system probably won't kill you. Not that I recommend you try to find out that answer. You were going to try to find out that answer, right? Okay, just making sure. But again, several of these consumed over a period of time could be problematic. Japanese or old world climbing fern, they're two different species. Not impossible to tell apart, but I won't expect you to speciate them in the plant clinic. They do get killed back by the winter cold, but they have rhizomes that they will recover from and come right back. Again, these will scramble along the ground and they will then climb up the trees, getting to the top of the trees, in some cases covering them so heavily with their leaves that they will exclude light from the desirable pine trees or oak trees or whatever host plant they're clinging to, and killing them by literally keeping the light away. The other thing, as I mentioned with the earlier in the module with Japanese and old world climbing ferns, is that they will bring fire up to the canopy. Now, in Central Florida, a lot of our plant communities are fire dependent. You may have heard that. In other words, fire is required for certain plants to clear out the junk, so to speak, have the pine cones open up, and then start anew. Now, why would we get periodic wildfires in Florida? Sure, we have drought in spring. We have a lightning strike early in the rainy season. The dry tinder would burn, and that would renew that particular area. That happens in many parts of the world. If you remember back somewhere in the 80s, Yellowstone was on fire and everyone started to panic and, oh, it's on fire, it's on fire. Well, that was a fire dependent community that we excluded fire for about 100 years of the park's existence, or thereabouts, or 80 years, or whatever it was, and a lot of the things had evolved into being very shady. Well, once the fire wiped out some of the shade, all of a sudden the park bloomed again in great, beautiful wildflowers in the late part of the 80s into the early 90s. It's part of the renewal process of Yellowstone, for example. But getting back to Florida, as I've digressed a little bit, so we have fire-dependent communities in Central Florida, and oak trees are fire-dependent, and pine trees, etc., etc., even palmettos. So fire comes up there, the bark of our native oak, Quercus virginiana. Interesting, it's virginiana, not floridana or whatever, but it isn't. Again, the point is the bark is very thick on our native live oak trees. That works like insulation, protecting the conductive tissue. Well, the bark is very thick around the trunk, but it's not very thick at the tops of the branches. So what happens is when these climbing ferns are all the way up to the top and even over on the branches is they bring the fire right up to the canopy, whereas if it didn't have it, it would be just nearer to the base of the plant. And therefore, a lot of these otherwise fire tolerant plant species are burned to a crisp to the point where they may not recover. The difference between the species of climbing fern. But again, I won't expect you to speciate. Erect sword fern. This is, or some people call it Boston fern. This really is a Boston fern relative. Yes, it was brought here for ornamental value, and it escaped cultivation very easily. Again, produces spores. It's a fern, so they move very easily in the wind. Now, Boston fern or the erect sword fern, it likes it very shady. Where I live in Brooksville, there are people who proudly have yards full of this as their lawn, if you will. They don't bother to control it because this is what has become a monoculture in some areas of Brooksville, some parts of Dave City. I see it sometimes in Zephyr Hills and other places that have a lot of large oak trees and other deep shade. Now, there is a native sword fern, but by and large, if you ever see a stand of sword fern or erect sword fern that thick like the left hand picture, that's going to be the exotic. It's not going to be the native. It's very hard to identify until you pull up on the root system and see the fuzzy tubers, the spherical tubers that are in the lower right hand picture. You can kind of see it looks like small little potatoes attached to the fern, but if you were to cut into it, it's by and large almost hollow, but fuzzy. Caesar weed, you may see this. People bring it in. It is kind of attractive in bloom, as you can see. I believe it's a hibiscus family member, if I'm right. And it's invasive primarily in Central and South Florida. Now, I've been talking about generally invasive for just here, but sometimes what's invasive in Central and South Florida may not be invasive in North Florida. Think about the climatological differences that we discussed in botany. They're into zone 9 or up there in the panhandle, 8A or maybe even 7B in some rare winters when it's really, really cold. So frost limits or freezes limit some of these plants from being a problem in the northern part of the state, etc. Again, people will bring this in, wonder what it is. Out of bloom, it may be a little bit hard to tell, but once you see it and feel the leaves, they have this raspiness, almost sandpaper-like texture to it. It's a pretty distinctive feel once you learn the plant. But this loves it in areas that's very shady. I see this a lot of times in Brooksville. I will see it here in Dave City in shaded areas where there's a lot of oak trees, and it'll become a monoculture. Nandina or heavenly bamboo. Uh, it, it is invasive in North and Central Florida, but not a problem in South Florida. It simply can't take the heat of South Florida for very long. It burns up. So, what may be a problem in one part of the state may not be a problem in another. But the funny thing is, although Nandina is a scientific genus, most of us call it heavenly bamboo. But it is not a bamboo. It is in the Berberdaceae family, the barberry family. And if you know barberries up north, they have been classified as invasive exotic plants. Now, Nandina was brought to the United States from, I believe, China or Japan. I can't remember which exactly, but it's not important to this story for ornamental value. It's evergreen and it has these pretty red berries against the green leaves, and they're primarily full of berries in the fall into winter. And further north, it can be cold hardy to up into parts of Philadelphia if you site it right. We used to grow it in Philadelphia in a courtyard, and it was very, very pretty in the winter months. Again, just because it's called heavenly bamboo, don't confuse it with the grass family members of bamboo, which are Poaceae. Kalanchoe. Some of you call it kalanchoe. I call it kalanchoe. Kalanchoe spus. That means several species are considered invasive exotics. Not all are invasive exotics, but many. Those pretty ones that you get usually in the fall with the thick fleshy leaves with the pretty flowers on there, pink, orange, yellow. You'll see them at all the box stores and the grocery stores right before Halloween, usually into fall of Thanksgiving. But the ones that are typically the problem are the various mother of millions, or cathedral bells is another name used for some of these. Usually they have serrated leaves, as you can see in the upper right hand photograph. And if you look at the lower left hand photograph, you can see that this particular species of kalanchoe, I don't know which one, so kalanchoe sp, it has all these little plantlets along the margins of the leaves. Those will each become an individual plant. This is typically what is called a pass-along plant. You get one because someone says, "Oh, if you put this leaf in a pod and lay it on the surface of the soil and give it a little bit of water, you'll have a bunch of cute little plants." And up north in a pot where it's nice and cold, and if it gets outside, it's going to freeze to death. It's not a problem. But a lot of people put them out in their garden or grow it in a pot, and then the leaves drop off and the leaflets, those little plantlets, start to grow in great abundance. Here is a picture of cathedral bells, a particular species of kalanchoe, Kalanchoe pinnata in this case, mother of millions is its common name. That should tell you something, boys and girls. Lantana chimera, lantana. Again, this is brought here to the United States for ornamental value. It's invasive in Central and South Florida, not so much a problem in North Florida because frost freeze will kill it pretty effectively. By and large, what we see in garden centers are sterile cultivars, which we can recommend. However, the orangey ones, as you can see in the upper photograph, those usually you see alongside the roads or around old citrus groves where it was a weed in the citrus. And they're usually very tall plants if they're not being controlled. They'll be about 5 or 6 feet in height. Whereas the sterile cultivars are usually dwarf in their habit and are usually yellows and purples, not oranges and yellows. Now, some people have argued that the sterile cultivars might pollinate native species of lantana. We do have a couple of species of lantana in the state of Florida. That argument is potentially valid. We'll leave it here for discussion some other time. Mexican petunia. I have the feeling many of you saw it in a garden center or was given a piece by a neighbor or a friend many years ago if you've been here for a while. And horticulturally speaking, it has everything you want. Drought tolerance, flowers much of the year, easy to grow, no insect problems, no disease problems. And that's true of many invasive exotic plants. The problem is it produces an abundance of seeds, which is a common underlying theme of many of our invasive exotic plants, and it also suckers. So you have one plant and all of a sudden you have a thicket of them because either seeds have dropped down and germinated or the mother plant, the original plant, is suckering every which way. Do not be confused by the dwarf ones. Some people say they don't produce viable seeds. From my experience, they do. Also, dwarf ones will sucker quite freely. Now, there is some work on some sterile cultivars being developed by the University of Florida. I am not particularly excited by that idea. I'll just be honest with you right here. Tropical soda apple. It is actually a cousin of the deadly nightshade, or the family that has potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant. So, although many things in the deadly nightshade family are poisonous, this particular plant is not poisonous. In fact, the fruit, as you can see in the upper left-hand photo, when ripe is kind of a yellowish green. When they're unripe, they kind of look like a watermelon on the outside. They vary in size from about a lemon to an orange, depending on the plant and how healthy it is. But each of those fruit produces 40 to 50,000, or each of the plants produce 40 to 50,000 seeds. The fruit is very, very attractive to various forms of wildlife and also cattle. If this is usually a problem in pastures where the rancher or farmer doesn't realize that one plant over by the fence post has fruit on it, and the cows love to be nosy and get over there, and the grass is a little greener on that side of the fence, and the cow will get in between that barbed wire and eat the fruit. They absolutely adore it. Meanwhile, those seeds will go through the cow or steer's digestive system, remain intact and viable. And meanwhile, it's being disseminated, moved around in the pasture, and given a bit of fertilizer in the process. What one plant in a pasture can become a forest in a pasture in a matter of a short amount of time. Generally, this isn't a problem in manicured landscapes, but you may see this brought in from time to time when somebody says, what is this? If interesting, you notice the leaves also have these spines to prevent probably herbivores from eating it. I won't go into a lot of details about some of the aquatic invasive exotics, but there are two to be on the lookout. You may occasionally get a question. Water hyacinth, it's not really a hyacinth, but because of the flower shape and color, it's gotten that common name. It is a free-floating weed. It'll float in big mats together, but it's not rooted to anything. It will squeeze out light for beneficial or good algae and other phytoplankton and things that do need light to help feed aquatic wildlife. And it can drastically alter the native vegetation and plant communities in the aquatic environment. It's a terrible invasive weed in the water. It was probably brought to Florida for ornamental in ornamental koi type ponds, but has since escaped into many bodies of water. Water lettuce is also free floating. As you can see, the lower picture is a pretty good example of what it's doing. It was introduced for use in aquariums and also ornamental ponds like koi ponds, etc. And it's illegal in many states, including Florida, but it is found in bodies of water floating about. When it comes to controlling either plants, water hyacinth and water lettuce, there are herbicides that are labeled to be sprayed onto them in aquatic environments. But this is something that the homeowner really can't do him or herself legally. Let's conclude invasive exotics and some identification and control, and join me for part two in a moment.